I never thought I'd have to sit in front of a camera to say something like this, much less say it with such seriousness. For a long time, I kept this to myself because it sounds harsh, because it's uncomfortable, because it shatters the idea that everything has a simple explanation. I myself was one of those who listened to testimonies and thought, something's imagined, something's exaggerated. That's why I want to make this clear from the start. I wasn't looking to see anything, I wasn't provoking anything, I wasn't playing at spirituality. My life was quite normal, with routines, common problems, and decisions that at the time seemed harmless. It all started like many things do these days, without alarms, without obvious red flags. Something that becomes a habit, something you repeat to feel better, to disconnect for a while, to not think. At first, you think you're in control, that you can stop whenever you want. I believed that too. And the more normal it becomes, the less you question where it's leading you. No one tells you that some paths don't warn you when you cross a point of no return. The night that changed everything wasn't special. There were no rituals, no strange music, no forced darkness. I went to bed like any other day, tired, my head full of scattered thoughts. I remember closing my eyes and feeling that normal sensation when your body slowly shuts down. Up to that point, everything was ordinary. What wasn't ordinary was what came next. I clearly remember the sensation of falling asleep, that moment when thoughts become jumbled and the body relaxes. Up to that point, everything was normal, but suddenly there was a precise point, difficult to explain, when I understood that my body was no longer responding, but I was still conscious. It wasn't the typical feeling of dreaming. There were no blurry images or senseless scenes. It was a strange, uncomfortable lucidity. I wanted to move and couldn't. I wanted to speak and no sound came out. The first thing I thought was that something wasn't right. I didn't feel panic immediately. At the beginning, it was more confusion. I tried to take deep breaths, to calm myself, to tell myself it was just a passing thing, but the more I tried to regain control, the clearer it became that my body was completely asleep, heavy, immobile, as if it no longer belonged to me. And the strangest thing of all was that I felt awake, more awake than usual, as if my senses were more alert than ever. At some point, I felt a pressure difficult to describe, not on my chest as many say, but an internal pressure, as if something were pulling me away from the inside. It didn't hurt, but it wasn't pleasant either. It was a profound feeling, like when you know something irreversible is happening and there's no way to stop it. There was no loud noise or jolt. It was silent, too silent. Suddenly, the room stopped feeling like my room. I didn't see it disappear, it simply ceased to exist. There were no walls, no ceiling, no bed, it was as if the space had disassembled around me. And that's when I understood something that shook me to my core. My body was asleep, but I wasn't in it. I don't know how to put it any other way. I didn't see myself lying down, I didn't observe myself from the outside, but I knew, with a certainty that can't be faked, that I was no longer where I was supposed to be. Then came the sensation of falling. It wasn't a quick fall like when you dream you're falling from a high place. It was slow, steady, endless. There was no wind, no sense of speed, but a complete loss of direction. I didn't know where I was going, I only knew I was descending. I tried to pray, I tried to think of anything to anchor me, but the words dissolved in my mind as if they couldn't quite form. Time ceased to have any meaning. I couldn't say how long that descent lasted. It could have been seconds or an eternity. The only thing I remember is a growing feeling of unease, of alertness, like when you enter a place where you know you're not welcome. There were no voices yet, no clear images, but the atmosphere itself conveyed something heavy, something oppressive. It was as if the air, though unbreathable, was saturated with something dark. In the midst of that fall, I thought of many things at once. I thought of my family, of decisions I had made without giving them much thought, of moments when I had felt something wasn't right and yet I still carried on. It wasn't an orderly review of my life, it was more like an avalanche of loose memories, like fragments colliding with one another. And the most unsettling thing was that I didn't feel like anyone was judging me. It was worse than that. I felt like I was understanding things I had previously ignored. There was a point where the descent stopped abruptly. It wasn't sudden, but it was definitive, as if I had reached a fixed place, a level from which there is no going back. And there, for the first time, I felt real fear. Not the fear of a movie, not the fear of something you know is going to end. It was a deep, quiet fear, without screams, a fear that settles in and doesn't need to move to be unbearable. It was at that moment that I thought with a clarity that still pains me to recall, that this wasn't an experience to recount, nor something symbolic, nor a mild warning. I felt like I was seeing something I shouldn't see, something reserved for later, not for now. And that awareness, that certainty of being out of place, was what shook me the most. There was no curiosity, no fascination, just an overwhelming feeling of having crossed an invisible border. My body was still asleep somewhere. I know because I felt it distant, like a blurry memory, but I was there, completely present, fully aware, facing something that didn't fit any simple explanation. And before I could process everything that was happening, I started to hear something. They weren't clear words yet, they weren't defined voices, it was a constant, deep sound, heavy with pain. And I knew, without anyone telling me, that what I was hearing wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The descent wasn't as I had imagined it my whole life. It wasn't a violent fall, nor a dark, windy tunnel hitting my face. It was something much more unsettling than that, because it was slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. It was as if someone had decided I had to go down, and the mere fact of wanting to resist had no weight. There was no physical force pushing me, but there was also no way to stay where I was. I was going down because that was the natural movement of that place. At first, I thought that at some point I would hit bottom, that I would reach a point where everything would stop and I could understand what was happening. But that moment didn't come. There was no ground, no reference point, no almost there. Just a constant descent that seemed to have no hurry, as if time that didn't matter. The most disturbing thing was that the more I descended, the more aware I felt. It wasn't a confused or blurry state, on the contrary, my mind was clear, alert, too present. With each passing moment, the atmosphere grew heavier. I couldn't say if it was heat, pressure, or something else, but it felt like a weight that kept increasing. It wasn't physical pain, it was a deep discomfort, like when you enter a place where something is wrong and your body knows it before your head does. There were no clear images yet, but there was a constant sense of warning, as if everything around me was silently telling me I shouldn't be there. I tried to think about normal things, my room, my daily life, anything that would bring me back to the familiar. But those thoughts felt distant, weak, almost unreal. It was as if what I had considered real my whole life was now blurred. And this, what I was experiencing at that moment, was the truly solid thing. That inversion of reality completely threw me off. At some point, I started noticing sounds. At first, they were barely perceptible, like a distant murmur, an echo I couldn't quite place. I thought maybe it was just my mind, mixing up memories or sensations, but the deeper I descended, the clearer they became. They weren't natural noises, not knocks, nor wind, nor movement, they were sounds charged with emotion. And that emotion wasn't confusion, it was pain. I can't say exactly when I understood that I wasn't alone. No one suddenly appeared before me. There was no introduction, no clear figure. I simply began to feel presences, not as bodies, but as beings, as if around me there were many others in similar states, descending or having already arrived somewhere further down. That feeling of companionship wasn't comforting. On the contrary, it was terrifying, because there was no communication, no solace, no contact. Each one seemed trapped in their own process. As I descended, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. No one seemed surprised. I didn't feel awe in those presences. I didn't feel questions. I didn't feel resistance. It was as if they all knew exactly where they were and why. That silent acceptance was harder than any scream. It made me think that this descent wasn't new to them, that it wasn't a temporary experience, but a state. I tried to pray, not in a beautiful or elaborate way, but as one prays when desperate, when one doesn't know what to say and only repeats learned words. But the sentences fell apart. It wasn't that someone was preventing me from praying. It was as if the words couldn't find anything to hold on to. They didn't disappear, but they remained floating, powerless, without direction. This made me feel a loneliness I had never experienced before. The descent continued, and with it a growing sense of loss, not the loss of material things, but of opportunities. I began to feel the weight of small decisions I never took seriously, moments where I could have stopped, changed, listened to that unsettling inner voice, and I didn't. It wasn't an external judgment. No one was pointing at my own conscience, clearly showing me what I had ignored. In that place, there was no rush, but there was no escape either. I didn't feel like anyone was chasing me or that anything was attacking me, and that, strangely enough, made it more terrifying, because they didn't need to. The mere fact of being there was enough. It was like a natural law. Once you enter that downward spiral, there's no turning back of your own volition. As time passed, the sounds became clearer. They were no longer indefinite murmurs, they were laments, stifled cries, sighs heavy with regret. They weren't desperate cries for immediate help. They were expressions of deep pain, of belated understanding. And that kind of crying is much harder to bear because it doesn't seek relief, it only expresses an accepted reality. It was then that I began to feel a different kind of fear than the initial one. It was no longer the fear of the unknown, but the fear of understanding too much, the fear of accepting that this place had rules, that it wasn't senseless chaos, that the descent wasn't an accident, a misunderstanding, or an administrative error of the universe. It was a process, and I was in the middle of it. I didn't see fire yet. I didn't see open abysses or terrifying figures, but the descent itself was punishment enough. That feeling of going further and further away from everything I had ever considered life, light, opportunity, was devastating. And as I continued to descend, with a clarity that pierced me completely, I understood something I had never wanted to accept. There are paths that are traveled little by little, almost without realizing it. And when you finally look down, you're already too far down to pretend nothing is happening. If you've come this far, it wasn't out of mere curiosity. This channel exists to warn, awaken, and share real testimonies. Subscribe to Testimony 777, like this video, and share it with someone who needs it. Sometimes a timely warning can change an eternity. The crying was the first thing that truly broke me. It wasn't seeing it, it was hearing it. Until that moment, everything had been sensations, a descent, weight, awareness, contained fear. But when that sound became clear, something inside me shattered. It wasn't crying like we know here. It wasn't someone crying because they lost something and hope to get it back. It was a deep, constant, relentless cry, as if it no longer had the strength to become a scream. It was a sound that didn't ask for help because it already understood that it wasn't coming. At first, I thought it was coming from a single place like a distant echo, but as I paid attention, I realized that it wasn't one, it was many, too many. They came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. There were no clear directions, no exact point to look at. It was like being in the middle of a space where pain had become the atmosphere, where crying no longer belonged to just one person, but was part of the place itself. That crying wasn't angry, and that was the most unsettling thing. I expected anger, shouts, violent despair, but no. What I heard was pure sadness, a mature, heavy, conscious sadness. It was the sound of those who had already understood. And when someone understands too late, the pain doesn't explode, it sinks. That's what I was hearing. Sunken, settled, permanent pain. As that sound surrounded me, I began to distinguish nuances. Not all the voices were the same. Some sounded tired, as if they had been crying for a long time. Others seemed more recent, as if they were processing where they were. There were gasping sobs, trembling breaths, laments that weren't expressed in clear words, but conveyed a message impossible to ignore. They weren't saying, "Get me out of here," they were saying, "If only there were," over and over again without finishing the sentence. At that moment I understood something that sent chills down my spine. That place was full of memory. No one had forgotten who they were, what they had done, what they had chosen. There was no amnesia, no confusion. Each one carried with them the intact memory of their life, their decisions, the opportunities they let slip by. And that memory was part of the torment. The crying didn't come only from the pain of the place, it came from the weight of conscience. I began to perceive presences more clearly. I didn't see them with my eyes, but I felt them. They were close, very close. It was like being surrounded by people in a dark room, knowing they were there, even though you couldn't distinguish them. Some seemed huddled together. Others motionless, others in a kind of repetitive motion, as if walking aimlessly. But they all shared something in common. None of them expected to leave. That hit me hard. I, even in the midst of fear, still had a part of me that thought this could end, that it was an experience, a warning, something temporary, but not them. In that weeping there was no expectation of change, no future hope. And that is something that cannot be faked. When someone loses hope, you feel it, you perceive it in the atmosphere, in the silence between one voice and the next. There was a moment when one of those laments became clearer to me. I don't know why, I don't know how. She didn't speak to me directly, she didn't look at me, but I felt her story. It was as if her pain had clung to me for an instant. I felt regret, shame, sadness for things that seemed small in life, postponed decisions, ignored warnings, habits justified time and time again. It wasn't someone who felt unfairly treated. It was someone who knew exactly why they were there. That made me tremble because it shattered many preconceived notions. I didn't see victims claiming innocence. I saw people understanding with brutal clarity that the problem wasn't an isolated mistake, but a series of convenient decisions. And the crying stemmed precisely from that belated understanding, from realizing that it wasn't a moment, it was a journey. The sound didn't stop, there were no comforting silences. Sometimes the crying lessened, became quieter, almost like a collective whisper, but it never disappeared. It was like an eternal background noise. And the longer I spent there, the more I realized that this sound wasn't designed to get anyone's attention. It wasn't an alarm. It was a consequence. I tried to close my eyes, although I don't know if they were actually open or closed. It was a reflex, like when something overwhelms you and you try to isolate yourself. But it was no use. The crying didn't enter through my ears, it entered from within. It was impossible to block it out. It was as if it resonated directly in my conscience, as if each lament found an echo inside me. At that point, fear changed form. It was no longer terror of the unknown nor anguish over what might happen. It was fear of appearing before them, fear of understanding that I was much closer to that state than I had liked to admit, because while listening to that crying, I didn't feel rejection toward them. I felt recognition, and that recognition hurt more than any threat. I realized that that place didn't need exaggerated punishments to be unbearable. The simple fact of remembering, of understanding, of not being able to correct was enough. The crying was the expression of that. There were no speeches, no external accusations, it was conscience speaking without filters, without self-deception, without distractions. In the middle from all of that, I thought about how many times I had heard warnings and taken them lightly. I thought about how many times I had said, later, tomorrow, it's not so bad. And hearing that crying, I understood that the problem was never not knowing. The problem was not wanting to stop in time. I don't know how long I listened to that sound. Time isn't measured like it is here, but it was enough to leave a mark that I still feel when I remember it. That crying isn't forgotten, not because it's loud, but because it's honest, because it doesn't try to convince anyone. It simply exists as an uncomfortable truth that keeps echoing, reminding everyone there that there was a moment when they could have chosen differently. And now all they can do is cry for having understood it too late. The hardest part wasn't seeing them, it was recognizing myself in them. In the middle of that place, surrounded by the constant crying and that feeling of awakened awareness that doesn't let you hide, I began to notice something that deeply disturbed me. It wasn't just that those souls were suffering, it was that many of them were too similar to people I knew, and some, in certain gestures, in certain emotions, were too similar to me not physically, but in something deeper, more difficult to explain. It was as if their stories resonated with mine. It wasn't an immediate revelation. At first, I tried to distance myself, to tell myself that I wasn't like them, that my life was different, that my mistakes weren't so serious. But the more time I spent there, the more those defenses crumbled. Not because someone accused me, but because it wasn't necessary. In that place, there were no masks, no one could pretend, and that brutal honesty laid everything bare. I began to perceive fragments of their lives, not as detailed memories, but as sensations, accumulated guilt, repeated decisions, ignored warnings. They weren't monsters, they weren't people who had consciously decided to do evil all the time. They were ordinary people who had grown accustomed to justifying, to procrastinating, to telling themselves there was still time. And that's what's shaken me the most, because that language was all too familiar. I felt shame, but not for them, for myself, because I understood that many of the things I had normalized in my life, many of the excuses I repeated to myself to keep things the same, were present in that place, not as anecdotes, but as consequences. I saw souls that didn't seem trapped by a single mistake, but by a long chain of small decisions they never corrected. And that's something one tends to underestimate while alive. There was a very clear feeling that pierced me at that moment. No one thought they would end up there. No one woke up one day saying, "I'm going to end up in this place." They all thought they could handle it, that it wasn't so bad, that they were in control. And that false sense of security was what led them there, step by step. Not suddenly, not with a spectacular fall, but with a slow, comfortable, almost invisible walk. As I observed, I understood that this place wasn't full of people who hated God. It was full of people who put him off. People who didn't reject him outright, but kept postponing him. People who traded depth for comfort, truth for distraction, conscience for habit. And that realization was like a mirror I didn't want to look into. I remember thinking, with a knot in my chest, that I was dangerously close to that same attitude. Perhaps not in the same ways, perhaps not with the same stories, but with the same pattern. Justifying what isn't right because it doesn't seem so serious. Minimizing what's uncomfortable because it confronts you. Saying tomorrow when something is asking for change today. That thought hit me harder than any image. At that moment I felt fear, but not the fear that something would happen to me, but the fear that this place had meaning. Fear of understanding that it wasn't unjust chaos, but an ordered consequence, that every soul there knew exactly why they were there, even though that knowledge was part of the torment. And seeing myself reflected in them, I understood that no one arrives there by surprise. There were no taunts, no accusing shouts, no one pointing fingers. Each one was too preoccupied with their own conscience. That taught me something I had never fully understood. True judgment doesn't always come from outside, sometimes it comes from within when you can no longer mentirti mass. And that internal judgment, without distractions, without anesthesia, is devastating. I realized that many of those faces, though I didn't see them clearly, conveyed a kind of resignation, not a quiet resignation, but a bitter acceptance, like someone finally understanding a truth they'd avoided for years. They weren't fighting the place, they were fighting their own memories. And losing that battle again and again was what kept them in that state of constant weeping. The more I observed, the clearer something became that made me tremble. I wasn't there as a neutral spectator, not just to watch. There was a reason they allowed me to see that, and that reason had to do with me, with my decisions, with the path I was treading without taking it seriously. That realization made me feel exposed, vulnerable, defenseless. I thought about how many times I had felt that inner discomfort that tells you something isn't right. And yet I kept going. I thought about how many times I traded depth for pleasure, right? For momentary relief. And seeing those souls, I understood that the problem was never a lack of information. The problem was a lack of action, a failure to stop when there was still time. That realization was painful, but it was also clear, not confusing, not exaggerated, clear as few things in life are. I understood that hell isn't just a place of punishment, but a place where the truth becomes impossible to ignore, where everything you avoided facing in life is presented to you unfiltered, without escape. And in the midst of that understanding, I felt something I didn't expect, gratitude. Not because I was enjoying what I saw, but because I could still return, because I still had time not to become one of those laments. That idea sustained me for a moment, like a thin rope in the middle of an abyss. And while I remained there, recognizing myself in them, I knew that this experience wasn't just meant to frighten me, but to warn me. Because there are mirrors that hurt, but they arrive just when you can still change what they reflect. What threw me off the most wasn't the place, nor the crying, nor even recognizing myself in those souls. It was realizing what they weren't asking for. I expected to hear desperate pleas to get out, cries for another chance, complaints of injustice, but no, that wasn't there. What was felt, what was heard again and again, was something much quieter and more devastating. The desire to go back, not to escape that place, but to return to a previous moment, to a specific point where everything could be fixed. It was as if they all shared the same thought. Although each one experienced it differently. They weren't saying, "Get me out of here," they were saying, "If only I had stopped, if only I had listened, if only I hadn't procrastinated." That if only was repeated like an invisible echo that permeated everything. And understanding that chilled me to the bone, because it showed that the greatest pain wasn't the punishment, but their awareness of having had real options and having squandered them. There was a clarity I'd never seen in anyone. Here in life, people always find a way to justify themselves. There's always an excuse, a context, a reason not to take full responsibility. Not there, though. There were no defenses. No one was deceiving themselves. Each soul seemed to have perfectly identified the exact point where they decided to ignore what they knew was wrong. They weren't talking about great tragedies or enormous mistakes. They were talking about small, repeated, normalized decisions. I felt a pressure in my chest when I understood that that place was full of later people who said, "Later I'll change, later I'll ask for forgiveness, later I'll get closer to God, later I'll leave this behind." And that later never came, not because there wasn't time, but because there was always something more urgent. Something more comfortable, something easier. Hearing that belated regret was like being punched. Slow but steady. It struck me to notice that no one was asking for a second life. No one was asking to start over from scratch. What they wanted was to return to a specific moment, just one. That moment when they felt the clear warning and chose to ignore it. That moment when they could have said no and said yes. That moment when they could have stopped and didn't. That was the point they wanted to return to, and that point no longer existed for them. As I absorbed all of that, I began to feel a different kind of anguish. It was no longer fear of what I was seeing, but of what I understood, because I, too, could identify my own moments afterward. Moments when I clearly felt that something wasn't right and yet I carried on. Moments when I preferred comfort to truth, habit to change. And seeing them, I understood that the problem was never not knowing. The problem was not acting when there was still time. There was no anger in that place. That really caught my attention. I had always imagined hell as a place of chaos, screams, and constant violence. But what I saw was lucid resignation, a bit acceptance, not because it seemed fair to them, but because there was no longer any possibility of discussion. The judgment didn't feel like an external sentence, but like a truth accepted too late. And when the truth arrives without the possibility of correction, it weighs like a ton of bricks. There was a moment when I felt one of those laments drawing closer. He didn't speak to me. He didn't point at me, but his regret was so clear I could almost put it into words. He was someone who had received clear warnings, people who had spoken to him, moments when he felt that inner discomfort that tells you to stop. And each time he chose to continue the same way, not out of malice, but out of habit. And that habit was enough. That made me think about how dangerous normalization is, how one gets used to living with things that at first make one uncomfortable, but then become part of the scenery. There I saw the final result of that habit. It wasn't spectacular, it wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense, it was silent. Constant, eternal, a state where regret doesn't lead you to change. Because change is no longer possible. The more time I spent there, the clearer it became that no one was waiting for rescue. That idea was devastating, because here in life, we always live with the feeling that something can happen, that there's always a way out, that there's always time. There. Not so much. There, time doesn't stretch, it's not negotiable. And that certainty made their regret even deeper. I thought about how many times I had heard phrases like "God understands. I'll get serious later. Now's not the time." I thought about how many times I myself had used them. And upon hearing that unanimous desire to go back, I understood that understanding isn't the same as approving, and that postponing important decisions doesn't make them disappear, it only pushes them to a point where they can no longer be made. That was one of the hardest moments of the entire experience, because I could no longer tell myself that this was exaggerated, symbolic, or emotional. What I was seeing had a terrifying coherence. Everything fit together, every lament made sense. Every regret had a root. And the worst part was knowing that many of these people had led seemingly normal, functional, even respectable lives. They weren't extreme cases. They were ordinary lives lived without spiritual urgency. There I understood something I still struggle to accept. Hell isn't full of people who never had opportunities. It's full of people who had them and let them slip away. And hearing that constant desire to go back, knowing it was impossible, was a stronger warning than any threat, because the true terror wasn't in the punishment, but in the impossibility of making amends. As that thought settled within me, I felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear because of what I was seeing, but relief because I still had time, because I could still heed that warning and do something about it. And that simple yet enormous difference was what sustained me in the middle of that place. Because understanding that you can still go back now, in this life, is something they no longer possess, and that truth weighs more than any fire. What I finally understood there was that punishment wasn't what I had always imagined. I grew up hearing that hell was fire, screams, relentless physical torment. And although there were sensations difficult to explain, what truly destroyed wasn't that. The worst part wasn't the heat or the oppressive atmosphere. Worse was something much deeper, something that doesn't fade or go to sleep. Consciousness is awake all the time. In that place, no one could be distracted. There was no sleep, no oblivion, there were no moments of disconnection. Each soul was fully aware of who they were, of what they had lived through, and what they had chosen. And that constant clarity was unbearable. Here in life, one takes refuge in noise, in excuses, in distractions. There, none of that existed. There was no way to escape oneself. I understood that the true torment was remembering without being able to correct, knowing exactly at what point you could have changed and didn't. Remembering warnings, opportunities, people who spoke, moments when something inside you said, stop, and you kept going. That memory didn't fade, it didn't soften with time, on the contrary, it seemed to become clearer, heavier. No one needed someone to actively punish them. There were no visible executioners or shouted orders. The weight of the truth was enough. Living with that eternal clarity, knowing that everything was avoidable, that it wasn't an accident or an injustice, but a sum of personal decisions, was the greatest pain. That's when I understood that hell doesn't need exaggeration to be unbearable. It's enough to remove all the lies we use to survive here. It's enough to leave a person alone facing their truth, without anesthesia, without pauses, and without the possibility of turning back. That is the punishment that never ends. Over time, I began to notice something that chilled me to the bone. Not everyone cried for the same reason. The pain was in everyone, yes, but it didn't have the same root. It was as if each addiction left a different mark, a particular form of lament. It wasn't something anyone could explain to me, it was simply felt. Each soul carried what they had clung to in life, and that very thing seemed to be part of their torment. Not because someone reminded them of it, but because they couldn't stop seeing,